Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 o'clock on my watch, so I think we can start. I hope everyone can hear me. I have load shedding at the moment, so I did test everything beforehand, so I hope it's okay. Um, Otherwise, just let me know. Okay, cool. I have a thumbs up. Thank you. And I hope everyone can see my screen. Um, yeah, so thanks for being here today. We're going to look a bit at the category of chemicals that we refer to as substances of concern and just some information on these chemicals and what it means and what you should know. The webinar specifically stated that we're looking at the CMRs and we will be looking at CMRs, which we will also explain what that means just now. But we'll also look at some of the other criteria for substances of concern. So before I start, you can use the chat box if there's anything specific that you need to know. I am probably not going to be able to multitask that well looking at the chat box, but I know there's a lot of people on the call that also have a lot of experience and knowledge on the topic. So please feel free to make comments in there or have discussions. Or if you don't agree with something I say, you're also more than welcome to have a debate about it. It's always good and we're all learning. And then Alrita just asked me to tell you or the people that's participating in the CropLife CPD system that you can do the assessment afterwards under category 3. So for those who are not sure if they're enrolled, you will know that you are enrolled according to Alrita. So if you don't know if you're enrolled for the CPD program, then it's not relevant to you. And unfortunately, I think I have mentioned it before, the CPD program is the CropLife internal CPD program, and I don't think it can be used for SACNASP CPD points. Okay, and then with that, I'm going to start with our presentation. Okay, so to firstly understand what a substance of concern means is we have to look at where this definition comes from in the first place. So where we're going to look at is Act 36 of 1947, and it's known as the Fertilizer, Farm Feeds, Agricultural Remedies and Stock Remedies Act, and it is the act under which agricultural remedies are regulated in South Africa. So just a description on the Act. So it's to provide for the appointment of a registrar of fertilizer, farm feeds, agricultural remedies, and stock remedies. And you'll see that it includes registration and also pest control operators to regulate or prohibit the importation, sale, acquisition, disposal, or use of any of these products, and then also to designate the appointment of technical advisors and analysts and all matters relating to these products listed in the name of the Act. Okay, so according to Section 3 of the Act, although it was published in 1947, the Minister may make regulations under the Act. So different regulations may be made under this section in respect of different classes or kind of fertilizer, farm feeds, agricultural remedies, and stock remedies, and in respect of different kinds of establishments and different classes or groups of persons. So the registrar has the power to make regulations under the Act that is then also further binding. And like I said, although the Act is quite old, it's been established since 1947. There has been several amendments to the Act, although the registrar has also informed us that the Act will be reviewed in the coming year or two. So I assume we'll get an updated one sometime soon. But because under the Act we can also make regulations, there has been several regulations published under the Act. And the newest regulation that's published under the Act was published on 25 August 2023, which hopefully most of you will be aware of. And it's the regulations relating to agricultural remedies. Okay, then just to give a quick display of exactly how this works. So we have the Act, and then we can make amendments to the Act. But under the Act, we can also have several regulations, and I've just included some of them. There's quite a few, so I just put in a few examples of the regulations that have been published under Act 36. And then right at the bottom, for those that work in regulatory will know that we also have guidelines. So the guidelines would be a further reiteration of the regulations to give us more detail on things that we need, for example, in a registration that is then complementary to the regulations. Okay, so then we have a look at the regulations that have been promulgated on 25 August. Here you can see that is just a picture of the government gazette in which it was published. And then the question is, if it's specific to agricultural remedies, what is an agricultural remedy? So for this, we have to look at the Act, because the Act specifies what in the industry would classify as an agricultural remedy. So an agricultural remedy means any chemical substance or biological remedy or any mixture or combination of any substance intended or offered to be used for the destruction, control, repelling, attraction, prevention of any undesired microbe, algae, nematode, fungus, insect, plant, vertebrate, invertebrate, or any product thereof. And then it excludes some for the medicines that's regulated under the Medicines and Related Substances Control Act. And then also plant growth regulators, defoliants, desiccants, or legume inoculants. Quite a mouthful, but I think what's important to note here is that an agricultural remedy essentially includes all kinds of products, biological products as well. It's not just chemical insecticides or fungicides or herbicides, but also pheromone devices, biological products, and anything where you essentially make claims of destruction, control, repelling, or attraction, or prevention. So yeah, quite concise. Okay, then we look at what is a substance of concern. So as we mentioned, it's specific under the regulations for agricultural remedies. And in our regulations, the definition of a substance of concern is provided. The substance of concern means any substance which has an inherent capacity to cause an adverse effect on humans, animals, or the environment, and is present or is produced in an agricultural remedy in sufficient concentration to present risks of such an effect. Such substances shall comply with the criteria as set out in Annexure A. Okay, then Annexure A gives us the rest of the information of what criteria the chemical needs to adhere to. Criteria 1, agricultural remedy, active ingredients, and their formulations that meet the criteria of carcinogenicity, category 1A or 1B of the GHS. And then I'll just go to criteria 2 and 3 because you'll see it's also category 1A or 1B of the GHS, but then it's for mutagenicity and reproductive toxicity, respectively. Criterion 4 is agricultural remedy active ingredients listed by the Stockholm Convention in its annexes A and B, and those meeting all the criteria in paragraph 1 of Annex D of the Convention, except for DDT used for malaria vector control by the Department of Health. Criterion 5, agricultural remedy active ingredients listed under the Montreal Protocol. So throughout the presentation, we'll just have a quick look at what this exactly means and what are we talking about when we list these criteria. The first three we're going to handle first, and you'll see obviously to understand what it means is you're going to have to understand what the GHS means. And I know some of you already know what the GHS is and also attended some of the previous webinars maybe where we've discussed this. So just bear with me, but to understand what those categories are or these hazard classes, we need to understand what the GHS is as well. Okay, so those three first criterion is what we sometimes abbreviate as CMR, which stands in for carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive toxicity. But it's obviously a mouthful to say it each time, so we just sometimes say CMR 1A, 1B. So for the new GHS classification, this hazard pictogram is used to show that a product is flagged as a carcinogen, mutagen, or reproductive toxin. However, also just note that this pictogram can also be used for other hazards in the GHS. So it's not limited to CMRs, but if a product is flagged as a CMR, then it will have this pictogram. Okay, so where did we hear about CMRs for the first time in the industry? So the registrar circulated a letter in April 2022 to inform industry that he intends to phase out active ingredients and formulations that meet the criteria of CMR categories 1A or 1B of the GHS. Okay, so the regulations that were published for agricultural remedies then further reiterated the registrar's intent to then get rid of CMR 1A, 1B products and other substances of concern. So we'll just have a quick look at what the regulations say about these remedies and this class of chemicals. Okay, so if we look at Regulation 3, it provides information to accompany the application. An application shall be accompanied by a declaration that the remedy does not contain active ingredients and or co-formulants or biological organisms regarded as substances of concern. Then also under Regulation 8, approval of the registration, you also have to the registrar may only approve your registration if he's satisfied that it does not contain substances of concern. And then Regulation 10 speaks about application for renewal. So during the renewal process, the applicant also have to submit a declaration to state that the remedy does not contain actives or co-formulants or biological organisms that are regarded as substances of concern. And then right at the end of the regulations, we see that all of these sections that's been referred to that relates to substances of concern comes into effect on 1 June 2024. So essentially that means that the registrar cannot renew your application or grant new registrations if it contains a substance of concern. But that's not the end. So you can get derogations for substances of concern. So if we look at Regulation 6 and 7 of the regulation, notwithstanding Regulation 8.1d, in exceptional circumstances where there are no other agricultural remedy, the registrar may grant registration of an implicated agricultural remedy when the following conditions are met. The risk to humans, animals, or the environment from exposure to the active substance in an agricultural remedy under realistic worst-case conditions of use is negligible. There's evidence that the active substance is essential to prevent or control a serious danger to human health, animal health, or the environment. Not approving the active substance would have a disproportionate negative impact on society when compared with the risk to human health, animal health, or the environment arising from the use of the substance. In this case, approval of an agricultural remedy may be granted for a specified period and for restricted uses following publication of a risk assessment report for public comment by the applicant. So this is the process that industry is currently busy with. So lots of you that is in the industry would know that we have identified a bunch of essential uses from grower associations for all of the products that has been flagged as substances of concern for which there are alternatives. So those would be regarded as essential. And if there's no alternatives, then the registrar may grant registration if you can show, like is stipulated at the bottom, if you do a risk assessment and you send it for public comment and there's no severe issues raised by public comments period, and your risk assessment shows that you can mitigate the risks of using that product according to the label for those specific uses, then the registrar can still grant that application. So I just need to mention as well that we are currently just doing minor revisions to the regulations, some of the wording. So essentially the gist of it is not changing, but some of the wording in the section is likely to change. So just take note. Okay, so seeing as we have essential uses for which there are no alternatives currently registered, the regulation also makes provision for the registrar to prioritize registration of suitable alternative remedies to replace substances of concern. So last year in November, we circulated the protocol to follow if you want to submit alternatives that could potentially be registered to replace a use that a substance of concern is currently registered for. Okay, and these will be prioritized, meaning the registrar and his team will look at it and try and approve it in a shorter amount of time than we usually wait for registrations. Okay. In Europe, we can see those regulations referring to biocidal products state that the following active substances shall not be approved, and it references carcinogens, category 1A, 1B, mutagen, category 1A or 1B, and reproduction, category 1A, 1B. So we can assume that this is spilled over from European legislation. Okay, so as we said, to understand carcinogens, mutagens, and reproductive toxins, we need to also understand the globally harmonized system of classification, seeing as that is the way in which these chemicals are classified. So just a short introduction on the GHS. So what is GHS? Essentially, it's a way in which we classify and label chemicals, and it's an internationally harmonized approach to do this, so that all chemicals across the world can be labeled the same, and all of these hazards communicated the same to facilitate international trade and also assist in safely using these chemicals, so that everyone understands all of the terminology and pictograms, so it reduces the risk of using these chemicals. So GHS in South Africa. South Africa has incorporated the GHS as the standardized method for classifying and labeling of hazardous chemicals. This became a requirement with the promulgation of the regulations for hazardous chemical agents, which were promulgated in March 2021. And with the promulgation of the regulations relating to agricultural remedies, this was also confirmed for agricultural remedies specifically. The final date for implementation of the GHS for agricultural remedies was September 2023. So essentially, there will still be some phase-in period where we will still see both old WHO labels and GHS labels on the market, but essentially, we should be seeing more GHS labels coming into play in the market. The guidance provided by the GHS need to be used in conjunction with the requirements of the competent authority. So the GHS provides guidance on how we need to classify chemicals. However, at the end of the day, the competent authority, which in this case is the Department of Agriculture, still decides at the end of the day whether they are happy with the classification and what type of data can be used to classify the chemical. So local legislation still has the final say in the classification. Okay, it's hoped that the application of the GHS worldwide will eventually lead to a fully harmonized situation where all chemicals across the world are labeled and classified similarly. Okay, why is this important? So there's lots of advantages to having a harmonized system, as we mentioned. It enhances the protection of human health and the environment by providing an internationally comprehensible system for hazard communication. It produces a recognized framework for those countries without an existing system. It also reduces the need for testing and evaluation of chemicals, which will become more apparent when we look at the classification and how it works. It facilitates international trade in chemicals whose hazards have been properly assessed and identified on an international basis. Okay, how does the GHS work? So the GHS provides standardized methods for the classification of hazardous chemicals according to their inherent properties. You would see that I made that section bold. That is very important, and we'll talk about it quite a lot throughout the presentation. The inherent properties that could pose a risk for humans or the environment. So it's standardized methods that results in standard classification. Based on the hazards identified, the resultant hazard communication is then also standardized. So if you have specific hazards flagged in the GHS, you'll have specific hazard communication that you have to put on your label and safety data sheet so that it corresponds to the hazards identified. To classify a chemical according to GHS, either experimental data can be used or the hazards can be inferred using standardized methods based on data already available for similar mixtures or the components of the mixture. So this is where reduced testing comes into play. We'll have a look at that a bit more. So just to understand what exactly the GHS does. So when we look at the different hazards that are covered under the GHS, we have physical hazards, health hazards, and environmental hazards. So those are the broad types of hazards for which we have then different hazard classes. So you'll see that the ones that we are talking about now, which is in bold, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, and reproductive toxicity, those are all classified under health hazard classes. So it affects human health. And then for each hazard class, you will have a hazard category. So for example, if we look at carcinogenicity, you will have a hazard category under which that carcinogenicity falls. And this category compares hazard severity within that hazard class, with category 1 being the most severe hazard category, and then it becoming less severe if you go down the line, like category 2 and then category 3 and so forth. So just an example, seeing as we're looking at carcinogenicity, you will see that category 1 is known or presumed human carcinogens, and it's subdivided in category 1A and 1B. So category 1 is the most severe hazard category. And then if you look at category 2, it's suspected human carcinogens. So it's less severe than category 1. Okay, so in the GHS, which is published by the United Nations, you'll have all of the methods and the way in which you need to classify your product is specified in the book. So if you look at chapter 3.5, you'll find all of the information on how to look at germ cell mutagenicity and how to classify it according to GHS. And then also chapter 3.6 covers carcinogenicity. Chapter 3.7 looks at reproductive toxicity. So all of the hazard classes are listed in the GHS book under different chapters, and all of the methods are provided in the GHS book. And then just how these hazards are usually tested. So we're not going to really look at physical hazards today, but essentially the manual of tests and criteria is used if we look at experimental data. But I'll just reiterate that the GHS also allows you to use different methods, and any good data that you have from good studies, so it has to be reliable, of course, can be used to use for classification under GHS. For health hazards, which are the ones that we will mostly be looking at today, we have OECD test methods, and it's usually standardized, but again, you can also use other literature and other methods as long as it's reliable. Environmental hazards, I've included it because there's two categories or different types of hazards. It's hazardous to the aquatic environment and hazardous to the ozone layer. And you would see, if you've noticed, hazardous to the ozone layer is substances listed in the Montreal Protocol. And this is our criterion 5 for substances of concern. So it's also covered in the GHS, but it's essentially also the chemicals listed under the Montreal Protocol that's included in criteria 5, and we'll look at it a bit later. Okay, so the GHS provides classification differences between substances and mixtures. So substances usually have test data. However, if we make mixtures, often we don't have data for the specific mixture. Sometimes we do, but essentially we can differentiate between them because substances we usually have data available for substances, but not always for mixtures. Okay, so classification of substances, usually we have test data that's used according to standard methods. And then for classification of mixtures, where test data is available for the complete mixture, usually it will be classified according to the same criteria as those for substances. And we'll come back to this one. Where the mixture itself has not been tested, but there are sufficient data on the individual ingredients and similar mixtures, bridging principles can be used, and we'll have a look at what that means. Where sufficient data is available on the individual ingredients, which are often substances, the hazard classification of the ingredients can be used to infer the hazards of the mixture according to standardized methods. So the GHS provides methods on how you can use the different hazards criteria that's already flagged for substances or the ingredients in the mixture, and then calculate your hazard classification based on those hazards. So I flagged this one because in general, in the GHS, you would prefer to have test data for the mixture. And if you do have it, then you can use it instead of inferring it from the various ingredients. However, you will see as we go through the CMR categories, it's not exactly the same. So they've kind of used the precautionary principle, and we'll just, I'll point it out when we get there, but just remember that it's a bit different for CMR categories, and the rest of the GHS, you would usually use your data for your mixture that you've tested if you have that available. Okay, so just to give you a nice view of what I just said. So if you do a GHS classification, it will be sometimes for a substance, and it will be sometimes for a mixture. The substance you have test methods for, a mixture you might have tested but might not. If not, you have different ways of inferring the hazard of the mixture according to methods, bridging principles, or the hazards that's already associated with the ingredients of the mixture. And then The bridging principles, I've just mentioned them here, dilution, batching, and substantially similar mixtures. I will explain what this means, but for some of the other hazards listed in the GHS, there's also other batching or bridging principles, but for CMRs, these are the only ones that are applicable. Okay, so before we continue, I think it's important just to look at the difference between a hazard and a risk. So we have to remember that the GHS provides us information on the hazards associated with a chemical. So it's a hazard classification system, and then also communicates those hazards and provides precautionary phrases for us to identify those hazards and then reduce the risk of the hazard. So the hazard is essentially, I think we always use the example of, for example, a car that is hazardous because lots of accidents happen on the road, but we have mitigation measures that will reduce the risk of us having an accident and for it being hazardous by using a seatbelt or abiding with the speed limit, etc. So what the GHS does, it gives us information on the hazard and not the risk. So you will see that the GHS states that basically the hazard and the exposure will give you the risk. And if you can minimize either hazard or exposure, you minimize the risk or likelihood of harm. And successful hazard communication alerts the user to the presence of a hazard and the need to minimize exposure and the resulting risks. Just to give you an example, so if we look at carcinogenicity, you can see the second part says classification of a substance or mixture as posing a carcinogenic hazard is based on its inherent properties and does not provide information on the level of the human cancer risk which the use of the substance or mixture may present. So I think it's just important to remember that the GHS only provides us the hazard classification, but it doesn't actually give us any information on the risk associated with using a product. Another important thing that we need to remember when we look at these classifications is what's called the precautionary principle. So essentially, the precautionary principle enables decision makers to adopt precautionary measures when scientific evidence about an environmental or human health hazard is uncertain and the stakes are high. The precautionary principle divides opinions. To some, it is unscientific and an obstacle to progress. To others, it is an approach that protects human health and the environment. Different stakeholders, experts, and jurisdictions apply different definitions of the principle, mainly depending on the degree of scientific uncertainty required for the authorities to take action. Although most experts agree that the precautionary principle does not call for specific measures, such as a ban or reversal of the burden of proof, opinions are divided on the method for determining when to apply precautionary measures. So in layman's terms, it essentially just means that we do a worst case scenario classification. So if we're uncertain whether a product, for example, is a carcinogen or not, and we'll have a look at how the EU classifies some of their chemicals and the panels of experts they have that look at it. They use the precautionary principle where if there's a divide between opinions, often they would just decide to take the worst case scenario classification for in case. So it's for safety. Okay, so now that we understand more or less what the GHS is, we're going to look at carcinogens and what exactly it means when we talk about a carcinogen in category 1A or 1B of the GHS. Carcinogenicity refers to the induction of cancer or an increase in the incidence of cancer occurring after exposure to a substance or mixture. subsequent studies on animals also to be presumed or suspected human carcinogens, unless there is strong evidence that the mechanism of tumor formation is not relevant for humans. So as we said, most of the studies that we do are animal studies. However, human data, if it's available, can be used. But obviously, we don't test chemicals on humans. But you would have some causal relationships and case studies available that might show you human data. Classification of a substance or mixture as posing a carcinogenic hazard is based on its inherent properties. This is what we've also mentioned before, and does not provide information on the level of the human cancer risk which the use of the substance or mixture represents. Okay, as we mentioned before, we have classification criteria for substances, and then we also have for mixtures. So when we look at substances are allocated to one of two categories based on the strength of evidence and additional considerations, which are called weights of evidence. In certain instances, the route-specific classification may also be warranted. So category 1 is known or presumed human carcinogens. So category 1 can be divided into category 1A and 1B. So these are the categories that is listed as substances of concern. Category 1A is known to have carcinogenic potential for humans, largely based on human evidence. And category 1B is presumed to have carcinogenic potential for humans, but it's largely based on animal evidence. Category 2 is suspected human carcinogens and based on human or animal studies, but the data is not sufficiently convincing to place the substance in category 1. So when we look at carcinogenicity, this is the section from the GHS. So here you can see category 1, category 2, and the difference between category 1A and 1B, and just some more explanation as it's written in the GHS. Okay, so classification as a carcinogen is made on the basis of evidence from reliable and acceptable methods and is intended to be used for substances which have an intrinsic property to produce such an effect. The evaluation should be based on all existing data, peer-reviewed published studies, and additional data accepted by regulatory agencies. So as we said, we use OECD test methods usually, but you can also use all existing data that is available if the competent authority allows you to use it. Okay, the carcinogenicity potential uses strength of evidence, which involves the enumeration of tumors in human and animal studies and determination of their level of statistical significance. And then also additional considerations. Beyond the determination of the strength of evidence for carcinogenicity, a number of other factors should be considered that influence the overall likelihood that an agent may pose a carcinogenic hazard in humans. I know there's lots of very difficult terms here. I didn't, for those doing CPD points, ask very difficult questions, I think. So don't worry about the difficult terminology. But essentially, different factors are used to determine whether a product is considered factors that determine whether there's actually a likelihood of you getting cancer being exposed to a chemical. So when we look at the strength of evidence, you can have sufficient evidence and you can have limited evidence. So sufficient human evidence demonstrates that causality between human exposure and the development of cancer, and sufficient in animals shows causal relationship between the agent and an increased incidence of tumors. But then if we have limited evidence, where we would usually place the compound in category 2. Limited evidence in humans is demonstrated by a positive association between exposure and cancer, but the causal relationship cannot be stated. And limited evidence in animals is provided when data suggest a carcinogenic effect, but are less than sufficient. Okay, the factors additional to the strength of evidence, we look at the weight of evidence. The factors can be viewed as either increasing or decreasing the level of concern for human carcinogenicity. Generally, there is a requirement for more complete information to decrease rather than to increase the level of concern. So the more data you have, the more sure you can be of whether it's not a carcinogen. So remember when we spoke about the precautionary principle, usually as a precaution, it will be classified as the highest classification that's warranted. Usually more data that becomes available would put it in a less severe category rather than a more severe category. Not always the case, but if we use the precautionary principle, it's usually the case. Okay, so there's also additional factors that you can use to look at whether the substance is actually a carcinogen and whether it's a relevant classification for the specific substance. So in your studies, whether responses are in single or both sexes, whether responses are in a single species or in several species, because it might be limited to a species, structural similarity or not to a substance for which there's good evidence of carcinogenicity, the routes of exposure, comparison of the absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion between test animals and humans, the possibility of a confounding effect of excessive toxicity at test doses, mode of action and its relevance for humans, such as mutagenicity, cytotoxicity with growth stimulation, mitogenesis, immunosuppression. So these are just examples. Don't worry, you don't have to remember them. So if you understand what carcinogenicity means and mutagenicity, and I'm sorry, I should have probably put mutagenicity first as it's covered first in the GHS. But essentially, if there is some overlapping of the two classes, it's recognized that genetic events are central in the overall process of cancer development. So therefore, evidence of mutagenic activity in vivo may indicate that the substance has a potential for carcinogenic effects. So sometimes when a compound is shown to be a mutagen, it could also be considered a carcinogen, but how that is determined will depend on the data available. Okay, just some further considerations for carcinogens. A substance that has not been tested for carcinogenicity may, in certain instances, be classified in category 1 or category 2 based on tumor data from a structural analog, together with substantial support from consideration of other important factors, such as formation of common significant metabolites. The classifications should also take into consideration whether or not the substance is absorbed by a given route, or whether there are only local tumors at the site of administration for the tested route, and adequate testing by other major routes show lack of carcinogenicity. It is important that whatever is known of the physicochemical, toxicokinetic, toxicodynamics properties of the substance, as well as any available relevant information on chemical analogs, i.e. structure-activity relationship, is taken into consideration when undertaking classification. And positive results in any carcinogenicity study performed according to good scientific principles with statistically significant results may be considered. Again, very technical information, but just to give you an indication of all of the things that need to be considered to classify something as a carcinogen. Okay, so the GHS also mentions that carcinogenic potency is actually not considered in this classification. So the relative hazard potential of a chemical is a function of its intrinsic potency, and there's great variability in potency among chemicals. And it may be important to account for these potency differences. Carcinogenic potency does not preclude risk assessment. So at the end of the day, as we said, it's a hazard classification system, and it provides you only the information that it is potentially a carcinogen. However, different chemicals have different potency, and if you do a risk assessment and you can show that even though it has carcinogenic potential, the risk is low, then it could still be a chemical that is safe to use. So that was the classification for substances. So as we said, usually you have substances that you test, and sometimes you test mixtures, but sometimes you will use the data that you have available for substances to classify mixtures. Okay, so if you have data available for the complete mixture, remember we mentioned at the beginning that if you usually in the GHS, if you have data available for the mixture, you would use that. So what's interesting about CMRs is it gives it would rather want you to use the precautionary approach. Classification of mixtures will be based on the available test data of the individual ingredients of the mixture, using cutoff values or concentration limits for those ingredients. The classification may be modified on a case-by-case basis based on the available test data for the mixture as a whole. In such cases, the test results for the mixture as a whole must be shown to be conclusive, taking into account those and other factors such as duration, observations, and analysis of carcinogenicity test systems. Adequate documentation supporting the classification should be retained and made available for review upon request. So this is a bit different than other GHS classifications or classes, I should rather say, hazard classes. So for CMRs, you can see that they prefer us to take the precautionary approach, and rather, if any of the ingredients are flagged as a carcinogen, you should flag the mixture as a carcinogen unless you have specific evidence showing that it will not be carcinogenic. Okay, so if you do not have data for the complete mixture, you can also make use of bridging principles. And I'll explain bridging principles in the next slide. And if data is not available for similar mixtures and you cannot use bridging principles, you will use the information for the ingredients, and in that sense, the mixture will be classified as a carcinogen when at least one ingredient has been classified as a category 1 or category 2 carcinogen and is present at or above the appropriate cutoff value or concentration limit. Okay, so just to quickly have a look at what bridging principles mean. So essentially, if you have data available for similar mixtures, you can use these principles to infer the hazard classification of a mixture that's similar. So if you're diluting a mixture, if a tested mixture is diluted with a diluent that's not expected to affect the carcinogenicity of other ingredients, then the new diluted mixture may be classified as equivalent to the original tested mixture. Then you can also use batching, and the carcinogenic potential of a tested production batch of a mixture can be assumed to be substantially equivalent to that of another untested production batch of the same commercial product when produced by or under the control of the same manufacturer. And then you can also look at substantially similar mixtures. The concentration of a carcinogenic ingredient is the same in a mixture with a known hazard classification and an untested mixture. The unknown mixture can be classified as the same hazard category as the known mixture. I didn't include the methods. Okay, so when we look at classifying a mixture and we have to use the precautionary approach, and you have to essentially classify a mixture as a carcinogen if any of the ingredients is present in the formulation in greater value than the cutoff values. You will see here is the cutoff values provided as in the GHS. So you can see for your formulation to be classified, or your mixture to be classified as a category 1 carcinogen, you need 0.1% of that classified ingredient in your mixture to classify the whole mixture as a carcinogen. So for category 2, it's a bit different. You will have more than 1% to classify it here, but I didn't include the notes. But for substances of concern, we're really looking at the category 1A and 1B. So important to remember, if the ingredient is present in 0.1% or more of your mixture, your whole mixture is classified as a 1A or 1B carcinogen. Therefore, a mixture containing 100% of a substance classified as a carcinogen category 1A or 1B has the same hazard classification in terms of carcinogenicity as a mixture containing 0.1% of a substance classified as a carcinogen category 1A or 1B. But will it pose the same risk? So that is the question, and that is just something to think about when we look at GHS and hazard classification, that we just remember that a hazard, this just provides information on the hazards and not the risks. Similarly, if we look at classification of a diluted mixture, and when doing a GHS hazard classification for a mixture containing an ingredient that is a carcinogen category 1A or 1B, and the mixture is constantly being diluted, the diluted solutions will consistently have the same hazard classification for carcinogenicity as the original mixture if the quantity of the mixture included in the successive dilution remains more than 0.1%. So unless we have data for the mixture, and even though the GHS would want to use the precaution 0.1%, all of those diluted mixtures will continuously be classified as category 1A or 1B. And then just if we look at the label elements, as previously mentioned, you'll see the health hazard pictogram on labels and STSs that are classified as carcinogens. And you can see it's included for both category 1, 1A, 1B, and for category 2. But the GHS signal word will be different if it's 1 or 2, with danger being used for carcinogenicity 1A and 1B. Okay, that was quite a mouthful. I hope it made sense. So we'll move on to mutagens, category 1A and 1B, according to the GHS. Okay, and mutagens in this section will specifically refer to germ cell mutagenicity. And this refers to the heritable gene mutations, including heritable structural and numerical chromosome aberrations in germ cells occurring after exposure to a substance or mixture. So if we say it's heritable gene mutations, it's in the germ cells, so it's egg cells or sperm cells. This hazard class is primarily concerned with chemicals that may cause mutations in the germ cells of humans that can be transmitted to the progeny. However, mutagenicity or genotoxicity tests in vitro and in mammalian somatic cells in vivo are also considered in classifying substances and mixtures within this hazard class. So you can also use data on somatic cells, meaning it's not germ cells, so it's just normal human cells, or it says mammalian cells, not human cells, to do your classification. So a mutation is defined as a permanent change in the amount or structure of the genetic material in a cell. The term mutation applies both to heritable genetic changes that may be manifested at the phenotypic level. So phenotypic is as it's expressed in the animals agents giving rise to an increased occurrence of mutations in populations of cells and or organisms. The more general terms, genotoxic and genotoxicity, apply to agents or processes which alter the structure, information content, or segregation of DNA, including those which cause DNA damage by interfering with normal replication processes or which in a non-physiological manner alter its replication. So essentially, germ cell mutagenicity has to do with DNA mutations in germ cells that can be heritable or transferred to the progeny. And as we mentioned before, because carcinogenicity is often also DNA changes, mutagenicity can sometimes also be indicative of carcinogenicity. Okay, when we look at classification criteria for substances, to arrive at a classification, test results are considered from experiments determining mutagenic and or genotoxic effects in germ and or somatic cells of exposed animals. Mutagenic and or genotoxic effects determined in vitro tests may also be considered. So you can either use mutagenic tests or genotoxic tests to determine mutagenicity. The system, again, is hazard-based, classifying substances on the basis of their intrinsic ability to induce mutations in germ cells. The scheme is therefore not meant for the quantitative risk assessment of the substance. So these are the categories as expressed in the GHS. So you can see category 1 subdivided into 1A and 1B. 1A, substances known to induce heritable mutations in germ cells of humans. Category 1B, substances which should be regarded as if they induce heritable mutations in the germ cells of humans. So those are the two categories that fall into our substances of concern definition. And then category 2 have the possibility that they may induce heritable mutations. Okay, the classification of individual substances should be based on the total weight of evidence available using expert judgment. In those instances where a single well-conducted test is used for classification, it should provide clear and unambiguous positive results. The relevance of the route of exposure used in the study of the substance compared to the route of human exposure should also be taken into account. When looking at mixtures, again, we can use the same test methods if we can for the complete mixture. However, using the precautionary principle, the GHS specifies that classification of mixtures will be based on the available test data for the individual ingredients of the mixture, using cutoff values for the ingredients classified as germ cell mutagens. And only on a case-by-case basis can you actually use data for the mixture itself. Again, the criteria is similar for what we looked at for carcinogens. If data is not available for the complete mixture, you can also use the principles, the bridging principles of dilution, batching, and similar mixtures. And then the preferred method, the mixture will be classified as a mutagen when at least one ingredient has been classified as a category 1 or category 2 mutagen, and is present at or above the appropriate cut-off value or concentration limit. And here you will see, similar to what we've had with carcinogenicity, again, if any of the ingredients that is flagged in your mixture is classified as category 1A or 1B, if it's present in your mixture in more than 0.1%, your whole mixture will be classified as a 1A or 1B mutagen, respectively. So the label elements according to GHS for mutagenicity, you will see that if it's classified as 1 or 2, it will have a health hazard pictogram as shown before. Category 1 will show danger, category 2 warning, and your hazard statements may cause genetic defects or suspected of causing genetic defects, which then corresponds to our hazard categories. Okay, then we look at reproductive toxins, category 1A and 1B of the GHS, and these are substances with the potential to cause reproductive toxicity. So reproductive toxicity refers to adverse effects on sexual function and fertility in adult males and females, as well as developmental toxicity in the offspring, occurring after exposure to a substance or mixture. Some reproductive toxic effects cannot be clearly assigned to either, but will be classified as a reproductive toxicant with a general hazard statement. So, as mentioned, reproductive toxicity can then be divided into two main headings. The one is adverse effects on sexual function and fertility on adults, and this includes all kinds of things that I'm not going to read in male and females that are adults. And then we also look at adverse effects on the development of the offspring. And this would be then any effect which interferes with normal development of the conceptus, either before or after birth, and resulting from exposure of either the parent prior to conception or exposure of the developing offspring during prenatal development or postnatally to the time of sexual maturation. So if we look at the corresponding hazard categories in the GHS, you can see category 1, known or presumed human reproductive toxicant. 1A, it's known human reproductive toxicant, and category 1B is presumed human reproductive toxicant. Category 2, suspected human reproductive toxicant. So you can see even for those two different headings that we've discussed, they are all grouped together in these categories and are not differentiated. We do, however, have an additional hazard category for reproductive toxicity that has to do with effects on or via lactation. So substances which are absorbed by women and have been shown to interfere with lactation, or which may present in breast milk in amounts sufficient to cause concern for the health of a breastfed child. Those substances will also be flagged for effects on lactation. And this it does not have a category per se. It just mentions effects on or via lactation, and then you will have additional information that you need to convey if the chemical falls into that classification. Okay, so the basis of classification. Classifying a chemical as a reproductive toxicant is intended to be used for chemicals which have, again, an intrinsic specific property to produce an adverse effect on reproduction. So it's an intrinsic, not be so classified if such an effect is produced solely as a non-specific secondary consequence of other toxic effects. And we'll go into that in a bit more detail, but essentially saying that if there's developmental issues, say for example, because the mother has toxic effects because of the chemical, but it isn't specifically a reproductive toxicant, then we'll just look into that into a bit more detail. Again, the precautionary approach comes into play, but it becomes a bit complicated. For human evidence to provide the primary basis for Category 1A classification, there must be reliable evidence of an adverse effect on reproduction in humans. Evidence used for classification should ideally be from well-conducted epidemiological studies, which include the use of appropriate controls, balanced assessments, and due consideration of bias or confounding factors. Less rigorous data from studies in humans should be supplemented with adequate data from studies in experimental animals, and classification in Category 1B should be considered. Classification as a reproductive toxicant is made on the basis of the total weight of evidence assessment. This means that all available information that bears on the determination of reproductive toxicity is considered together. So the weight given to the available evidence will be influenced by factors such as the quality of the studies, consistency of results, the nature and the severity of the effects, the level of statistical significance for intergroup differences, the number of endpoints affected, the relevance of the route of administration to humans, and freedom from. And both positive and negative results in studies can be used in the weights of evidence determination. So if during the weight of evidence assessment, it can be conclusively demonstrated that the mechanism or mode of action has no relevance for humans, or when the toxicokinetic differences are so marked that it is certain that the hazardous property will not be expressed in humans, then a substance which produces an adverse effect on reproduction in experimental animals should not be classified. In some reproductive toxicity studies in experimental animals, the only effect recorded may be considered of low or minimal toxicological significance, and classification may not necessarily be the outcome. So this will all be based on expert judgment. Data from animal studies ideally should provide clear evidence of specific reproductive toxicity in the absence of other systemic toxic effects. If appropriate information is available, it is important to try to determine whether a developmental toxicity is due to a specific maternally mediated mechanism or to a non-specific secondary mechanism, like maternal stress and the disruption of homeostasis. So, for example, when the mom can't necessarily breastfeed because of high stress, is it a reproductive toxin, or is it a secondary issue based on the toxicity of the chemical or some other means of toxicity, like, for example, acute toxicity? The presence of maternal toxicity should not be used to negate findings of embryo or fetal effects, unless it can be clearly demonstrated that the effects are secondary, non-specific effects. So this is another point where the precautionary approach comes in. So essentially, if you cannot demonstrate that the maternal toxicity is not necessarily a reproductive toxin and you have an impact on the offspring, then you would rather classify it as a reproductive toxin, unless you can show that it's a secondary non-specific effect that's not a reproductive toxin. In some situations, it is reasonable to assume that reproductive toxicity is due to a secondary consequence of maternal toxicity and discount the effects. So if you can show that it's a secondary consequence, then you can you don't have to classify it as a reproductive toxin. So as we mentioned, development of the offspring through gestation and during the early postnatal stages can be influenced by toxic effects in the mother, either through non-specific mechanisms related to stress and the disruption of maternal homeostasis, or by specific maternally mediated mechanisms. It is believed that the maternal toxicity may, depending on severity, influence development via non-specific secondary mechanisms. Developmental effects which occur even in the presence of maternal toxicity are considered to be evidence of developmental toxicity, unless it can be unequivocally demonstrated on a case-by-case basis that the developmental effects are secondary to maternal toxicity. So again, another example of the precautionary approach. Unless you can show that it is a secondary effect, you will classify it as a reproductive toxin. And classification should also be considered where there is significant toxic effects in the offspring. Classification should not automatically be discounted for chemicals that produce development toxicity only in association with maternal toxicity, even if a specific maternally mediated mechanism has been demonstrated. In such a case, classification in category 2 may be considered more appropriate than category 1. However, when a chemical is so toxic that maternal death or severe inanition results, or the dams are prostrate and incapable of nursing the pups, it may be reasonable to assume that developmental toxicity is produced solely as a secondary consequence of maternal toxicity and discount the developmental effects. So this is, again, something that's probably dependent on expert judgments, but of course, if something is so toxic that it kills the mother and consequently the baby dies, then it's not necessarily a reproductive toxin, but it's some other toxicity mechanism that has killed the mom, which then killed the baby. So expert judgment will have to be used to then determine, but essentially you wouldn't then classify it as a reproductive toxin. In principle, adverse effects on reproduction seen only at very high dose levels in animal studies would not normally lead to classification unless other information is available. Okay, again, if we look at the classification criteria for mixtures as also for carcinogens and mutagens, again, we have the precautionary approach. And classification of mixtures will be based on the available test data of the individual constituents of the mixture using cutoff values, and the classification may be modified on a case-to-case basis if you have data available for the mixture as a whole. Again, you can use bridging principles, dilution, batching, and similar mixtures. And for data available for ingredients, the mixture will be classified as a reproductive toxicant when at least one ingredient has been classified as a category 1 or category 2 reproductive toxicant and is present at or above the appropriate cutoff value or concentration limit. The mixture will be classified for effects on or via lactation when at least one ingredient has been classified for effects on or via lactation and is present at or above the appropriate cutoff value or concentration limits. Here you can see the table that's provided in the GHS for the cutoff values. So again, category 1, reproductive toxicant. So your mixture would be classified as a category 1 if it contains more than 0.1% of an ingredient that is classified as such. And there's different notes, which usually refers to label elements that you need to include depending on the cutoff values. I didn't include that. And then again, your whole mixture will be classified as a category 1B if more than 0.1% of an ingredient is flagged as category 1B. Same for category 2, and then our additional category for lactation is also more or equal to 0.1%. Okay, again, the label elements for reproductive toxicity shows that we use the health hazard pictogram to indicate that it is a reproductive toxin. Category 1 will have the signal with danger, and category 2 will have warning. You'll see there's no GHS signal word or pictogram for the additional category for lactation, only a hazard statement. Okay, so that's our CMR categories. So for those that work in regulatory, you would know that a formal list of the agricultural remedies, active ingredients that are classified as CMR has been circulated by Act 36. And this was circulated on 17 October. So there were a few discrepancies. So we did ask them to re-look at some of them. It is also important to note that classifications, the registrar has indicated that classifications come from the registration holder, and a lot of these classifications come from ECHA, which we'll have a quick look at just now. But because the precautionary approach is used, sometimes the classification is might be a category 1 on ECHA, and then as we saw in some of the text, if you have more data, often more data is needed to contest the classification because of the precautionary approach and to actually decrease the category or the severity level of the classification. Okay, so the European Union has a database where they keep the GHS classifications for chemicals, and it's called ECHA. So lots of information is available there, and essentially, if they do experimental studies or they look at classification of chemicals according to the GHS, they load this data onto the European Chemicals Agency database, and then something just to refer to. So they have harmonized classification. So you'll see sometimes there's a notified classification and sometimes a harmonized classification. So just to understand what the harmonized classification means. So for hazards of highest concern, carcinogenicity, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, and respiratory sensitizers, and for other substances on a case-by-case basis, classification and labeling should be harmonized throughout the EU to ensure an adequate risk management. This is done through harmonized classification and labeling. Harmonized classifications are listed in Annex 6 to the CLP regulation and should be applied by all manufacturers, importers, or downstream users of such substances and of mixtures containing such substances. So essentially, the European Union wants all chemicals to be classified the same. If they've decided on the precautionary approach and something is classified as a carcinogen, mutagen, or reproductive toxin, it will be listed on ECHA, and everyone in the European Union has to use that classification. And then just to give a bit of context, because I think it is sometimes scary when we hear all of these things are carcinogens and mutagens and reproductive toxins. And it's also sometimes difficult when we don't have context. I think we all have to remember that chemicals inherently have toxic properties often. So just to give examples of everyday things. So if we look at estrogen, so the ECHA website was down today, so I can check if it's still the same. I've downloaded from the ECHA, it's a notified classification, not a harmonized one. But if we look at estrogen, essentially what lots of women use today as a contraceptive, it is classified both as a carcinogen 1B and a reproductive toxin 1B. Also, if we look at vitamin A, vitamins are obviously vital for people and essential to use. But if we look at retinaldehyde and retinol, which is vitamin A, we can see it's a reproductive toxin category 1B. So just to remember, all things are poisoned and nothing is without poison. Only the dose makes a thing a poison. So we have to remember that the GHS provides information on hazards and it doesn't provide us information on risks. So we just have to have context when we think of these things. A good example might be to think of the acid and enzymes contained in your stomach. It doesn't do any harm because it's in your stomach and your stomach has a lining. But everyone knows that gets heartburn as soon as it comes out of your stomach. It affects other cells, and you can also get throat cancer if that happens, because obviously enzymes outside of your stomach and acid outside of your stomach is hazardous. So I think context is also important when we look at the classification of chemicals and the hazards as opposed to the risks. Okay, so that's it for GHS. So we can move on to the Stockholm Convention. You'll remember that that is criteria 4 of substances of concern in the regulations. So just to recap your memory, agricultural remedy active ingredients listed by the Stockholm Convention in its annexes A and B, and those meeting all the criteria in paragraph 1 of Annex D of the Convention, except for DDT used for malaria vector control by the Department of Health. Okay, so the Stockholm Convention aims to eliminate or restrict the production and use of what we call persistent organic pollutants. So it's an international treaty, and it was adopted at a conference in 2001 in Stockholm, Sweden, and entered into force in May in 2004. And the Secretariat of the Convention, the duties is performed by the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. Okay, so the Stockholm Convention consists of Annex A, elimination. So these are chemicals that needs to be eliminated. Annex B, restriction, chemicals that need to be restricted. Annex C, chemicals that are produced unintentionally. Annex D, information requirements and screening criteria. Annex E, information requirements for the risk profile, information on socioeconomic considerations, arbitration and conciliation procedures for settlement of disputes. So if we look at our criterion 5 in the regulations, you'll see that we have to look at Annex A and B and those meeting all the criteria in paragraph 1 of Annex D. So elimination, restriction, and the screening criteria needed to include a chemical in the Stockholm Convention. So we'll have a quick look at that. Okay, so all of the information is included on the Stockholm Convention's website. So if you want more information, you can always go have a look. So Annex A is essentially chemicals that are classified as persistent organic pollutants that the convention aims to eliminate completely. Each party shall prohibit and or take the legal administrative measures necessary to eliminate its production and use of the chemicals listed in Annex A, subject to the provisions of that annex, and its import and export of the chemicals listed in Annex A in accordance with the provisions of paragraph 2. I didn't include all of that information. Okay, so you can see some of the examples of chemicals listed in Annex A. Annex B is restriction. So each party shall prohibit and or take the legal administrative measures necessary to restrict its production and use of the chemicals listed in Annex B in accordance with the provisions of that annex. And you will see DDT is listed there. So DDT hasn't been used as an agricultural remedy for a very long time. I think most of you will be aware of it, especially after Silent Spring, and there was a lot of noise about the chemical and its persistence in the environment. So just to quickly mention that DDT isn't used in agriculture in South Africa. However, as also stipulated in the regulations, we do use it as for malaria vector control, and that is according to the guidelines provided by the World Health Organization. Okay, and then if we look at Annex D, which was also mentioned in the regulation, this annex provides the criteria for listing a chemical as a persistent organic pollutant in Annex A, B, or C of the convention. And this is just a screenshot of the document with all of that information. And the importance of this is including this in the regulations and saying that a chemical that falls within this criteria means that a chemical that fulfills the criteria set out in Annex D can still be regulated under Act 36 as a substance of concern, even if it's not specifically listed in Annex A or Annex B of the convention. So just to have a look at what is included in Annex D. So essentially it gives you the information requirements for anyone to list a chemical on Annex A or B and C of the convention. So you have to provide the chemical identity, data on the persistence, bioaccumulation, the potential for long-range environmental transport, and adverse effects. So just if a country wants to include a chemical, they send this information to the Secretariat, and then all of the countries decide together whether it's included on an annex. So just some more information on the information that they need to submit. So the chemical identity, the persistence. So essentially, if the chemical has a half-life in water greater than 2 months, a half-life, so the time that it takes to break down in the environment is quite long, and it differentiates between half-lives in water and soil and sediment. So essentially, if it's very persistent in the environment and doesn't break down easily. And then bioaccumulation. So if the compound accumulates or bioaccumulates in the environment in, for example, aquatic species, and they then give specific cutoff values for which, if it's over that cutoff value, then it can be submitted for inclusion in the convention. Okay, evidence that a chemical presents other reasons for concern, such as high bioaccumulation in other species, high toxicity or ecotoxicity, and monitoring data and biodata indicating that the bioaccumulation potential of the chemical is sufficient to justify its consideration within the scope of this convention. Then also potential for long-range environmental transport. So if it is transported from the site where it's applied to other areas. And then any adverse effects, because obviously it's not necessarily important if it doesn't have adverse effects, but if it has adverse effects, then it's important that it's persistent and bioaccumulates and may have environmental impacts that's negative. And then we have a quick look at the Montreal Protocol, which is the last one. So the Montreal Protocol is our criterion 5 in the regulations. So it's also done by the UN Environmental Programme. Essentially, the Montreal Protocol regulates the production and consumption of man-made chemicals referred to as ozone-depleting substances. When released into the atmosphere, these chemicals damage the stratospheric ozone layer that protects humans and the environment from harmful levels of ultraviolet radiation from the sun. And this protocol has been adopted on 16 September in 1987 already in Montreal, Canada, and it entered into force in 1989. So my knowledge with regards to these compounds in agricultural remedies are limited because most of these are refrigerants, chemicals that might be in aerosols or refrigeration, like refrigerators and air cons, etc. So this is a list of the annexes of the chemicals that's included in the Montreal Protocol and regulated under the protocol. So both of the Stockholm Convention and the Montreal Protocol is governed by the UN Environmental Programme. And what's also interesting is it's got different phase-in requirements for developed and developing countries. So there's specific dates set for which countries need to abide by for when they need to have eliminated certain compounds from production or import. And this is different for developed and developing countries. And South Africa is listed as a developing country and is a signatory to both of these conventions / protocols. Okay, so I think that is the end of our webinar. So thanks so much. Those are the 5 criteria for substances of concern. I hope everyone now has a bit more of an idea of what it entails and the situation that we're currently dealing with, phasing these out in agricultural remedies. I know it was a bit of lots of technical information. I hope it made sense. And I saw there were quite a few chats going on in the chat box. I'll have a look at them. But if you have any questions, please let me know. My email is on the screen. You're welcome to email me at any time. And thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you spending your Friday afternoon with me. Thanks, everyone.